Hello and welcome to another interview of Kayhan Life. This special interview is in advance of Nowruz, and allow me to use this occasion to wish you a very happy Nowruz, and welcome to you, Mr. Amir Taheri, our editor of Kayhan in Iran and also here in London.
Yes.
Thank you for accepting our invitation. How do you see the Nowruz of this year taking place?
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be with you again, Nazenin, and happy Nowruz to all friends and compatriots who may be watching this program. Nowruz is an occasion for joy, it's an occasion for regeneration, it's an occasion for the restoration of life, even where there is no life. And as the current Iranian year draws to a close, I could say that we had a good year. We had a year full of passion, full of struggle, full of hope, full of resistance. The Iranian people showed that they are beginning to understand that there is another way for Iran, that Iran deserves better than what it has. That Iran should look to a future that reflects its past greatness. It should go back to its roots, the roots that make us grow again. Like, this is a spring and it's a moment of growth. So I'm very optimistic, because as long as Iranians are on the side of life, on the side of creativity, there is hope. Iran for me has always been, throughout history, like an eternal fountain. Sometimes it disappears and you see, that's it, that's the end of it. And then suddenly it reappears with greater energy and greater passion for life somewhere else, where you least expect it. So my expectation is that Iran will come back and Iran will become Iran again.
Well, you have always worked on this thesis that there's a difference between the Islamic Revolution as a cause and Iran as a country, and that there's this duality that the system has been struggling with since its inception. How do you think that duality is working out now?
Well, that duality works in the same way as it had worked throughout history. When a nation ceases to act as a state, and it is forced to act as an ideology, it has always been a cause of regression, it has been a cause of civil war, it has been a cause of tension, of misery throughout our history. If you look at our history, whenever Iran acted as a state, it was a great nation state. You have Cyrus the Great, you have Darius the Great, then you have Mehrdad the Great and the Parthians, then you have Ardeshir and Shapur the Great. Fast forward, I don't want to go throughout all our history to the Safavids. We had Shah Ismail, we had Shah Abbas, and more recently we had Reza Shah the Great, who all of them, if you look, they came to assume charge of Iran's destiny after Iran had passed through a period of turmoil caused by ideological factors or by other causes of instability and chaos. And they all succeeded in a fantastic way. Don't forget that as we are talking now is also coincides with the 143rd year of Reza Shah's birth, Reza Shah the Great, who assumed the leadership of Iran when Iran was really in a pitiful way, and 20 years later, or in fact as a king only 16 years later, Iran was suddenly back in the community of nations as a respected power, and was back on track of history. What has happened in the past 40 years is that we have had leadership, a regime that has tried to keep us outside world history. Whereas the irony in all this is that, according to Hegel, the German philosopher, world history started with Iran. Because before that, there was no world history. There were disparate communities just living their local parochial life. And the Persians, by creating the first empire, they created the history of the world. And now we have a leadership that wants to keep us out of the history of the world. And their points of reference is some affabulation about the 7th century and so on. They look for, if you like, bygone days as an indication to the future. Whereas, we have always been a forward-looking nation. We have been an innovating nation, and I think this is what we want to be once again.
And Iran, as a sovereign country, signed so many different international agreements.
Well, yes, if at the end of the Shah's regime, we had joint economic commissions with 32 countries. We had joint staff military conversations with 17 countries. Now we have 2, with North Korea and Syria, if you consider Syria a country, which has ceased to be. Iran was the only country, probably in the world, but certainly in the Middle East, that had no border problems with anybody. All our borders were demarcated and registered and so on. It was the only country in the world that had not been involved in any war or in any conflict with any of its neighbors for decades. Even very advanced countries in Europe or in the American continent still have border problems with themselves and tense relationships. We didn't have that. We had the best of relations with the United States. We had the best of relations with the Soviet Union, although we were not in the so-called non-aligned movement. We had the special dispensation with the common market at the time, which became the European Union. It was something signed by our economy minister, your namesake, Kayhan Ansari, and Lord Tugendhat of Britain. And Iran was the first country outside the European Union to be given access to the common market and being treated as an equal of the founders of the later European Union at that time. Whereas now, we can't even join the World Trade Organization because the present regime says, we cannot accept import of pork products, alcohol, and makeups for ladies and things like that. Which is ridiculous, because if you don't want to import it, don't import it. You don't have to ban it. Don't buy it. The funny thing is that these people, I don't think they are so dumb. They are certainly intelligent, being Iranian, but they have worked themselves in a cobweb of deceit from which they cannot liberate themselves. I'm sure they know it, because they have PhDs from the best universities in the United States, but then they behave like the dumbest backwoods man would do.
Well, obviously, these laws are fine if it's in Iran, banning them in Iran, but their children, they are all outside of Iran and they can enjoy those benefits. And that is the contradiction that we also face.
Well, that's not a contradiction, because, under the Shah, Iranians invested heavily in the education of their children. I don't think any other nation did that, both inside Iran and outside Iran. Unfortunately, that trend has continued. And the new rulers of Iran, although they say they hate the Shah and so on, they are doing exactly the same thing. As soon as they have some means, I don't want to name anybody, but I know many of their ministers and former ministers and top officials whose children are studying in the United States or Canada or in various European things. And that's not a bad thing. Maybe they will be open to the new one. And this is what we all wanted. We wanted for all Iranians to be that. The problem is that the present regime denies the majority of Iranians the same opportunities that were available under the Shah. All we want is to make those opportunities available again for all Iranians, not only for those who are in power.
But there is a worry that, yes, we want all of these. There is all this hope. But how can we achieve it without bloodshed or without a war? And certainly there are already quarters outside of Iran, in the United States, in Europe, that are blaming the opposition for being warmongers.
Well, the first thing to do is to sow the seeds of a logical discourse in Iran. And we have to win the argument to start with. What is our argument? Our argument is very simple, is that today Iran, possibly apart from North Korea, is the only country out of 198 countries in the world that does not behave as a nation state. A good or a bad nation state is a different issue. We want Iran to re-become a nation state. This is the argument, that we have to spread this. And we have also to win the second argument, which is that the task of politics is to solve the problems of the people, to make the lives of the people better. The task of politics is not to make Islam great. The task of politics is not to destroy the United States. The task of politics is not to destroy Israel. The task of politics is not to make all, 1.5 billion Muslims subscribe to the cult of personality of the Iranian Supreme Guide. These are all nonsense. We want a political system in which people have security, people have freedom, people have an opportunity to work. They have good schools, they have good hospitals. We want bread and butter politics. And this is, from the beginning, when the science or art of politics was invented, this was the task of politics. If you want something else, you go somewhere else. If you want to go to paradise or heavens and so on, so you go for religions. There are lots of religions in the world. There are more than 500 religions in the world. You go and do your religious thing. Nobody is against that. If you want, to live in a surrealistic atmosphere, go and write your poetry or do whatever you like. But politics is a serious thing. And the present regime prevents Iran from having a normal political life. So this is the first step.
But how is the transition? How can the transition take place? Certainly we are in a period of transition since December, when the people took to the streets. But how can we cross that?
Yes, but this is, the preparing the ground. Because if you haven't won the political argument, you cannot create political change. Once it has been done, there are many ways of this transition taking place in other different countries. It could be peaceful, it could be violent, it could be a mixture of both, and we cannot rule in advance that we will exclude this way or we exclude it. I don't exclude anyway. If the present regime wants to fight, we'll fight it. If they want to fight with guns, we'll also fight them with guns. If they want to resist the tide of history, let them resist. They are losers. They will, in the end, be defeated. There is no doubt about it. But the best way is that a major section of the present regime decides to abandon it and join the people, because they know that they are at the end of the line, even for their own interests. In that case, we could promise them forgiveness, we could promise them mercy, we could promise them a place in future Iran, and this has happened in other societies. When that went there. The second thing that must happen is that the regime's coercive forces, the Revolutionary Guard, the army, fortunately, is more sympathetic to the nation, and other police forces and so on, realize that killing their own people for a losing regime is not a good policy. You have to switch sides. And there are many people within the present regime, in their even in their Islamic parliament, even in among their governors, I don't know, and so on, or in their bureaucracy, who are beginning to understand that if they want to be part of the Iranian people, they have to abandon their Sikh ideology and become servants of a nation, not servants of something mythological and in the name of the Khomeinist ideology. This can happen, but let us first focus at the moment on the first phase, which is to win the argument, to convince a majority of the Iranians of three things. First of all, that this regime is doomed. It cannot solve any of your problems. It cannot even defend your borders. It cannot even ensure your security. They are lost. The second thing that we have to convince the Iranian people is that we have the potential to do better. We have the manpower, we have the natural resources, we have the combination of international situations that could favor us. Everybody wants Iran to become a nation again, because Iran is the last big nation that is outside the global system. Imagine if it comes back, everybody will profit. Everybody will make money, even our foreign enemies would benefit, those who are our enemies now and our friends tomorrow. And the third thing is that if we can achieve this transition with a minimum of losses, with a minimum of violence and so on, the better for everybody else. These are the things we should focus on at the moment.
And how do you see the movement outside Iran, within the Iranian diaspora, within the Iranian exile community, within the Iranian expatriate community?
Well, I'm very encouraged because, I see the many different ideas. There is an explosion of ideas and energy all over the place. Of course, there is a bit of confusion. We make mistakes because we are novices in politics. We don't have political experience because for the past 40 years we have been kept outside the modern world and outside modern politics. But we are learning fast. Iranians learn fast, and these competing ideas, these competing views and projects, it gives the Iranian people a vast choice. It's like going to a big supermarket, and people will choose whatever they like. So all the talk of uniting the opposition, especially outside, I'm against it. We don't want organizational unity. We don't want to create a commission or one flag. We want unity of the hearts. We want unity of understanding. We want unity of analysis. We don't want, a formal unity. And I think this is happening because I talk to Iranians of all sorts of views and ideas, and the focus is on the minimum we have in common, our Iranianness and our humanness. The rest, you are free to think whatever you like, to have any religion you like, to have any ideology you like, any political ideas, and we want an Iran in the future in which we'll have many political parties, we'll have trade unions, we'll have associations. We want an Iran of diversity because we are coming out of an Iran of enforced unanimity.
Well, these are all beautiful words and very true as well, but I'm trying to imagine how can power be transferred from the government, but you cannot transfer to the hopes of the people. How do you see that developing?
Well, it is not easy to say in advance because history is never written in advance. The important thing is that conditions for a change in Iran are there. Now, how it will happen? It could happen in many different ways. In some countries it has happened through a military coup. It has happened through a putsch, like Reza Shah and Said Zia under Ahmad Shah, which was a bloodless putsch. It could happen through a sudden change of a big section of the present regime, like it happened in Czechoslovakia with the communist parliament suddenly deciding that communism is finished. It could happen like in the Soviet Union with Yeltsin jumping on a tank and saying the Soviet Union is dissolved. In many, many different ways. Deng Xiaoping in China.
But could it also be like Syria?
Well, it could not be like Syria, but this is it requires a longer discussion. But very briefly, I can tell you why. Because first of all, Syria was a fractured society to start with, and it's an artificial country. It was even the word Syria was invented by the French, because this was part of a province of the Ottoman Empire, which was called Sham or Shamat. And there you have a mosaic of different people who had little contact with each other. You had the Druze, you had the Nusayris or Alawites, you had the Turkmens, you had the Shiites, the Sunnis, the Ismailis, the Arabs, who have never blended with each other as a nation. This is the first. The second difference between Iran and Syria is that in Syria you had the Ba'ath Party, which was in charge and had 2 million members. In Iran there is no party. One of the failures of the present regime is that unlike, for example, communist China or Soviet, they don't even have a political party. It's various groups that like the either down of Mullah Nasreddin, they pull it this way and that way. And so the other difference between Iran and Syria is that the Syrian people could not decide whether to address their internal divisions or their main division with the regime. Whereas in Iran it is clear, in Iran we don't have ethnicities fighting each other or religious groups fighting each other. We have all the Iranian people, as you saw in the last year's demonstrations, was really fantastic, because these demonstrations were not class-based, because you had rich and poor together. They were not gender-based. You had women and men together. There was not religious-based. You had Christians, Jews, Muslims, Baha'is, everybody was together. It was not ethnicity-based, because you had Kurd and Baluch and Turkmen and everybody together. And there is an Iranianness, which has a very, very long history. There is no Syrianness. Syrianness was beginning to come into being, and maybe these past 7 years of misery that the Syrians have suffered brings them together and gives them the sense of Syrianness. So in future there could be a Syrian nation. So the present regime tries to frighten the Iranians. Says, "Oh, don't do anything, you will be like Syria." And finally the situation in Syria is like that because somebody intervened in it from outside. The Assad regime was finished, as General Hamadani of our Quds Corps said. He said, when we arrived there, we said, in 2 weeks' time, this regime is going to collapse. But who is going to intervene in Iran? There is no power to do that, to come and crush the Iranian uprising. Will Russians intervene? The Russians intervened 3 years later in Syria, but Syria is a very small place. You could go and bomb people and that's it. In Iran, you can't do that. So, we should not be deceived by the regime's propaganda aimed at frightening us. Say, shut up or you will be Syria. We tell them, no, shut up, you are Syria.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Taheri. I hope that we will be able to, next time that we sit and have this chat, there will be more good news coming our way.
I expect that. Thank you.
Thank you.